Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Philosophy Today podcast, hosted by me, Joel Bennett. Today's episode is going to be focused around the philosophy of the Native American populations, with a specific focus on the Iroquois Confederacy, interactions with Europeans, and how this influenced their kind of forms of government and their ways of life. Thus, this podcast will be cut into kind of three parts almost. First part being an introduction to the ideas, the second part being somewhat of a contrast to European ideas, and the third part being how this influenced the government of the Iroquois Confederacy in particular. So without further ado, I'm going to focus on the first section, an introduction to Native American philosophy. The term Native American philosophy is quite a broad one, in fact. I mean, the Native American population spread across a continent, the continent we now call America, of many hundreds of different peoples speaking many diverse ranges of languages. Thus, due to their experiences in this landscape and day-to-day life, their philosophies developed very differently. Despite this, many contemporary philosophers have been able to centralize many of their thoughts into kind of a few main doctrines, a few main ideas which are very universal across the different traditions, which I'll go over now. Just to preface this whole introduction, many of the great traditions of early American philosophy were never recorded in text, so often do not have a place in modern scholarly work. But what I will attempt to introduce is what is known to the kind of Western philosophical viewer, listener almost. So to begin with, we should discuss the connection of Native American philosophy to nature. Much of the philosophy which we know, the Enlightenment philosophy, saw nature as something that could be conquered, something that can be, taken over for the good of human beings. The idea of the world being our dominion, which obviously links back to biblical themes. Obviously, stewardship is a part of that, but in the end of the day, it's the human need which is, always going to dominate the need of nature almost. It's always subservient. But this relationship is very different in the Native American kind of view of the world. They believe that the needs of nature are always the dominant needs of the world, of humans. Humans are merely a part of nature. They're not the gods of nature. They don't hold dominion over nature. They're simply a being. They're simply a species, an animal operating in nature. And thus, conservation is a gigantically important part of their philosophy. They, strongly emphasize links between God and the world being a manifestation of their idea of God, their idea of a deity, and thus themselves identifying closely with nature. There's no need to conquer nature in that sense, therefore. Oftentimes, storytelling is a key part of Native American philosophy. That's often how much it was transposed between generations. It was put into words, oftentimes due to their nomadic lifestyles. I mean nomadic in the term of the male population. Oftentimes it was the male population that would go out and hunt and would be away from the village for a long amount of time. And would thus cultivate, very strong nomadic speaking traditions. Often travelling philosophers and travelling religious men and wise men would spread knowledge throughout settlements across the continent. However, stories like this didn't end outside of the camp. They travelled back to the camp, to the home village, to the hometown many people lived in, and these stories are spread to the women, to the children. And this formed a strong ideological almost basis for Native American societal organisation. A strong reverence for nature, a living in harmony with the beasts of the world, to put it like that. Many times it was quite an informal business by our European standards. Their philosophy was carried out. It was often seen as part of them living life. It wasn't so much as an alien thought or something only possible to higher beings, but it was a universal fundamental principle of their day-to-day life, which I still believe can be counted as philosophy. It's still, the basis of this thought is complex and is deep-rooted and has a lot of traditional roots within the way they live their lives. Um, Oftentimes, the concept of all my relations is used in Native American philosophy, which emphasizes to a strong extent a communal identity between all humans, a relation not being limited to the family sense as we see it, or to even friends, but to a village, to a community, to a race, to beyond races even, which is a very holistic view of human beings, and it's not just limited to human beings. In fact, it can go to plants, to animals, to all manner of living creature, even down to the rivers which people fished in, to the hunting grounds which boar and buffalo were shot and eaten. But even this was in strong contrast to the European view of hunting, where hunting was somewhat of a sport. It was a very one-sided affair. The Native American population viewed hunting as a necessary evil. It was just part of one life taking another, and it wasn't in any way unsustainable. The population reduction due to human consumption was very low, in fact, in relation to the entire population, due to means of sustainability, means of maintaining a kind of order in nature, almost. The view that nature is already in itself in order and doesn't need to be modified for human need to be perfect. The perfection of the world exists as it is, and thus too much of an aberration away from that. The hand of the human is wrong. It's a disruption of that balance. Balance and harmony, like I mentioned, is a very important element of Native American philosophy. It's very key in looking at dynamics of dark and light, the interplay of positive and negative forces in the world, and thus, to an extension, this goes on to life and death. Death was seen as a very noble part of Native American life. It was seen as the fate of the warrior, the fate of usually the man in the situation, and even when it extended to women and children, it was seen as a working of the universe, something out of the hands of the population. Oftentimes, death was seen as something which must be conquered in the ideas of Western progress and Western philosophy. It was seen as something which must be taken down. Many argued in the Western canon that was an aberration to God, that was against his plans, but our ideas of enlightenment thinking clearly push us down a very scientific path, a very empirical path, a path of mastery of the world. But the Native American view of nature was not, like I said, not one in need of mastering. Death was simply inevitability. When it came, it came. Thus it was such an important part of life, death, almost. Death was seen as a jubilant occasion. It wasn't so much that man's life was built around death, or there was some kind of innate death drive, but life and death coexisted. They were necessary for each other. Life could not be so beautiful and so fulfilling in this worldview without the necessity of death. While one engages in the world, they must leave it too. Oftentimes, this extends to the kind of rituals and ceremonies of the Native American population. The death ceremonies and the death processions were very ingrained into tradition, almost. It was seen as a moral passage, a spiritual passage, a community passage, a way of the celebration of life, which is very familiar to Europeans, and a way of communicating with gods and deities and unifying themselves with the world as a whole. Oftentimes, Native American philosophy wasn't so much focused on empiricism. I mean, empiricism in the sense that we look at the world and we see it through numbers and analysis and a constant stream of questioning. Oftentimes it was very spiritual, very mystical, almost. The ceremonies were seen as a way of connecting to ultimate knowledge in a spiritual manner. Ultimate knowledge was to be gained through a kind of ascension of not ascension of the being so much, but a connection of the being with nature, with the connection of people and human beings around them, their relations, and the world, its animals and its sights and its beauty. An example of a great ceremony was the lodge ceremony, which involved a sort of sun dance or powwow, which was known as a kind of direct, a direct reference to the sun as a immensely important part of their life. The sun was no phenomena in the sky; it was essentially totally ingrained in their everyday to day life. We can compare this to a lot of pre pre mass agriculture European beliefs, which praise the sun, especially in Austria, in southern Germany. The Sonnenfest, I think it's called, is still celebrated today actually, which harkens back to the pagan era of Germany, the tribal era, one with no agriculture. And it's very understandable to see the developments of certain nature worship and sun worship within such pre-agricultural societies, as oftentimes the sun and the seasons and nature were the things which presented themselves to be the barrier between life and death. They were the god of these pre-agricultural societies, and thus it's very natural that this tradition extended to the Native American societies, who, despite having a very agricultural focus and very strong agriculture, and quite technologically advanced, a hunter-gatherer element was still very important in their lifestyle, especially in the more nomadic peoples. Thus, this reverence for nature and spiritualism and connection with each other was very, very important. And to some extent, we can see how this manifests in the daily life of the Native American society. Oftentimes, many societies are very matriarchal, in fact, which is very interesting because of the nature of the hunter-gathering element of the society. Many men would spend a lot of time away from the villages, a lot of time away from children, a lot of time away from wealth in general, and thus women would be the custodians of wealth, political power, economic power, and would run the villages, run the economic units, run certain agricultural elements in the meantime, which is very curious. A great example of this was the Iroquois Confederacy, who are commonly known as one of the first kind of modernizing tribes of the Americas. They had some of the most kind of integration with European trading, with European, with European contact almost, and languages. And obviously this is, their notability is quite debatable, it's quite controversial obviously, because many may propose that due to their contact with Europeans and their introduction of their ideas just for the means of survival and the means of integration almost, it dulled down, it gave a European slant to their thought, but we, due to the European contact, we thus have the most information available, so it's a bit of a way-up operation when you're looking at the Iroquois Confederacy. They had a lot of Western influence in them, but they still were, in themselves, Native Americans living on authentic Native American land with authentic beliefs. And their philosophy was visible in the way they lived life. The Iroquois Confederacy was a very interesting situation, actually. While a confederacy today, in the European terms, may be seen as a collection of states, all a functional government, all brought together in a kind of unified political sense, the Iroquois Confederacy was still a tribal formation in many ways, a confederation of 5 tribes, and itself was not called the Iroquois Confederacy within its organisation, but the Haudenosaunee, which demonstrates, the ability of European influence to define even the names and the nomenclature of these groups. But the Confederacy had a very interesting government form, which was built around longhouses, whereby the longhouse was seen as a form of parliament, but not just a parliament, also a debate chamber, a speaking room, a legislative room, a law writing room in many ways. And it was always headed by a matriarch, this political structure. Oftentimes, you can see what we could call direct democracy taking place in these, hunting lodge as we would call them, hunting lodge governments, whereby a council would be elected, not directly, obviously not in the way we see it, but elected among a tribe, among a group, among a community, and they'd go and sit in the house, sit in the lodge, I mean. Then other communities would elect their own representatives, and thus these representatives would elect a matriarch, a leader of this kind of society. So it's very interesting to see how oftentimes a great reason for, I don't say great as in good, I mean a terrible reason for the conquest of the West, and the conquest and the assimilation and murder of these Native American tribes was the fact that they were seen as so incompatible, so backwards with the European way of life, with democracy, with modernization, as it said, with any kind of rational thought, that their beliefs were so barbaric that they would never permit anything but war. It's this, the way their society manifested itself was often very more democratic than European societies at the time, far more civilized in many ways, far more peaceful in its political processes than many Western societies. I mean, the Iroquois Confederacy was a power which obviously diminished once the American influence started to fall into the country, and the Canadian influence, due to its position in the Great Lakes kind of area. But oftentimes this confederacy was just a fantastic example of, even in our Western sense, a very democratic, quite a free society, a very communal society, one with functional government, and shows the compatibility between traditional Native American philosophy and a modern government. That such mysticism, such spiritualism, is in fact quite a boon to community action. It's quite a boon to community cohesion in many ways. It brings people closer. Such the elements of all my relations, and such the elements of the connection with the world, would result in a government which didn't have its primary aim in the exploitation of land, for example, or the enslavement or the exploitation of its citizens. It had no interest in that due to its, its view of the world, its ontology being focused around that of equality, that of community, and that of naturalism, that of appreciation for the natural world. So in fact, many ways, the Native American philosophy was very important. The early Native American philosophy, should I say, was very important in establishing quite democratic government and quite a good way of living. And it's such a shame that this has been ignored and desecrated and wiped from history books. In 1811, there was a famous case brought by a U.S. senator on the study of the Iroquois Confederacy. 1811, the Confederacy had much declined since then. Its political power had been eroded from outside forces. The area was entirely under control of the US and Canada at this point. This senator himself claimed that the Iroquois Confederacy was the Rome of the Western world. Obviously the Western world in referring to the New World, the Americas. They were the Rome of that period because they'd never been studied so much, but they were a great political force, and they were quite astounding, even to the modern contemporary, even to the modern scholar in the Western tradition. They had very impressive feats, impressive forms of government, impressive ways of living. They were even described as the Rome, like I said, which I believe demonstrates quite an important stage of development, almost, because it really disproves the idea of development being very linear, another idea of the establishment. And the idea of development was not so much ever a part of Native American philosophy. The world was seen as perfect as it was in its natural form, one free of human intervention in any overtly overreaching manner. And this idea of development and its consequences in that of exploitation and the destruction of nature as we see today would never happen. So it's quite possible that even many of the ideas that we see nowadays in terms of the socialism in the world, the eco-socialism especially, very popular amongst young people, can take a lot of influence from these early Native American ideas and their philosophies. Realistically, the students of 2023, supposedly the most educated people with access to the most information in the world, will in fact start to form views far more similar to that of the Native American populations in terms of the connection with nature and the importance of community. We've witnessed, in the wake of the rise of neoliberalism, many ideas which were extremely individualistic, extremely focused on a very rigid view of development, focused on monetary gain, focused on the destruction of communities and the atomization of individuals. Whereas it's often been proven that that is not a very conducive way to government. It's not a very conducive way to run society. So the most educated people of the next century perhaps will be drawing ideas from Native American philosophy. And this is, I believe, a fantastic testament to the immortality and importance of these thoughts for study. Thus, Native American philosophy is an impressive feat and is, more than deserving the title of philosophy. An oral tradition was one which was so in touch with the knowledge production of that society, thus that the outcome was philosophical in many means. It was the philosophy of that society. It would be ridiculous to dismiss it based on the idea of textuality, when the importance of their views and the relevance of them, in even completely different societies, across boards, across time periods, is so apparent. Thank you very much for listening to this podcast. I know it rambled on a bit, but I hope that offers an interesting kind of introduction to a few ideas and the perhaps potential impacts of these ideas in the future. It's been your host, Joel Bennett. Thank you very much for listening. Many apologies, this is post-editing Joel. I'm just adding in a few sources and recommendations for further reading at the end of this podcast. I'm going to start with this YouTube video, in fact, by the channel Historia Civilis, which is expertly researched and sourced itself, and is a more detailed account, I'd say, with fantastic graphics, which goes into the political structures of the Iroquois Confederacy, the way of life. Obviously, these two things being a result of the communitarian, naturalistic, the conservationist, the spiritualist kind of structures of Native American philosophy and thought, which have gone to influence the government. It's a very great portrayal of this in real terms, and a lot of similarities can be drawn between modern Western democratic republican governance and earlier Native American forms of governments, through the function of parliamentary bodies, or more generally legislative bodies, often, headed by a matriarch, in fact, which is quite different to many European countries. And secondly would be a journal article called The Influence of the Iroquois on Early American Philosophy by Scott L. Pratt. It's about 41 pages long. That's including references, though. But it's a fantastic read if you want to know more about the cultural exchange between early American settlers and the Iroquois. It's great in, destroying the old narrative of a very one-sided domination, a history which doesn't place any agency in the hands of Native Americans. It strips away their thoughts of the most base human desires, it strips away their philosophy to nothing but folk tales, it destroys any kind of notions of governance that they had amongst their own people. It's a very good article and it's very informative. I strongly recommend both, of course. Thank you again for listening. This is me signing off now. Thank you very much. Goodbye.